Hey sophomores, so you're currently watching the lecture video for Wide Sargasso Sea Part 1, pages 15 to 41. So essentially the first half of Part 1. So I'm going to shift over this way to get started. I'm going to put a PowerPoint slide up here so you can kind of view as and see that as I'm talking and kind of follow along. You'll probably also want to have your book and make notes as well. So whether you make notes in your book, make notes on another sheet of paper, whatever works best for you. This PowerPoint slide is going to be available under the topics page, and so you can access that, download it, use it to reference, and as you kind of progress and move along. So one thing that I kind of want to talk about and encourage you to make note of, especially if you're annotating, and you hopefully are annotating, I guess if you're overwhelmed with there's so many components to this novel, really, even if for it being so short, there's so many layers to it. And so if you're like, I don't know what's annotated, I don't know what you want me to look for, I guess think about these four things in general. And the first is characterization, both direct and indirect. And thinking about essentially kind of your main characters, Antoinette, Christophine, and of course eventually Mr. Rochester, if you want to focus on those three, but also honestly if you notice characterization of all the other minor characters, that's really helpful as well. In terms of how does Jean Rhys develop them, through their speech, through their thoughts, through the effect on other people, through their actions, through their looks, how they're described, in what ways does she develop them? Are they seen in a positive light, negative light by the readers, and what might be the purpose behind that? Other things that you might want to note, of course, are the motifs and symbols. And the list of those symbols and motifs are found in the background PowerPoint if you don't remember. Maybe write them down on a piece of sticky note and stick it somewhere so that if you notice, oh my gosh, it's a mention of mirror/reflection, or there's a mention of dreams or fire, you can kind of annotate and make note of that. And all of this, of course, leads us into themes. And again, those themes are also listed under the background PowerPoint as well. And so if you're noting and saying, wow, I'm seeing this development of gender roles, like in terms of how they talk or a line they mention or something that she thinks, highlight that and go gender roles. Or, psychologically in terms of identity and how she defines herself, oh, she seems confused by herself, make note of that. So those are things that you might want to keep track of, especially in terms of helping with your discussion posts and also helping with your literary lenses assignments that are due every Sunday. So up next, we're going to kind of go straight through and turn to page 15 and essentially look at the very first line actually of part 1, because I think the very first line sets up so much in terms of sets the tone of the novel, sets up in terms of some thematic ideas, and just there's a lot going on in the very first line. So the first line says that they say when trouble comes, close ranks, and so the white people did. And so one thing I actually want you to do that might help you is I actually added between comes and close people, just because it helped me clarify the sentence better. They say when trouble comes, people close ranks, and so the white people did. And so one thing that you want to look at is the first part of it. They say when trouble comes, people close ranks. One, what kinds of trouble are suggested in the opening lines of this novel? What trouble? What does that mean? And then two, what does it mean to close ranks? And that's kind of like a battle strategy, military term. To close ranks is exactly what it sounds like. It's to, come closer together, to unite. So when trouble occurs, let us all come together and let us all unite, which is a pretty, standard and logical line of reasoning and line of thought. And so I also, again, want you to think about trouble, right? I talked about that 2 seconds ago, but think about the historical context and the setting of the novel. Remember that we are set in the 1840s, so it's a little shortly after the Britain Emancipation Proclamation. And so the slaves have been freed. However, we know that there were problems with the transition from freed slaves to really being full citizens. Just because someone is freed does not mean that their lives are better, does not mean that everything is equal. So you have to understand the perspective of the mass majority of the islanders, that they have been freed, but they are still living these very difficult lives. And how would you feel if that was you? And so there's a lot of resentment being built, by those who were formerly enslaved. And so you have this idea of being this emotion and this anger and this kind of festering and being built up, right? So again, be mindful of perspective, like understand both sides of a story in terms of why maybe someone is angry, why maybe someone's treating someone else hurtfully, and then of course be mindful of, like the reasoning behind all of that. She starts off, our narrator Antoinette, they say when trouble comes, close ranks, and so the white people did, but we were not in their ranks. And so that's something, the second sentence also tells you a lot, right? It tells you a lot about Antoinette, especially understanding that or that you should know, Antoinette herself is white, but the fact that she says, but we were not in their ranks. So already in the first two sentences, you have a sense of alienation and isolation. You have the idea that she's already distinguishing herself as separate from other people, that she is aware that she is not like the other white people. And of course, contextually, we know why, we understand that, hopefully, if you watch the background video / went to class, but you're kind of seeing all of this set up. So already you have a pretty dark tone. You also have, themes of isolation. You have racial tension. You have all of these components wrapped in the first two sentences of it. And I've already spent 6 minutes at this point. This is, okay, I'm not going to spend every single moment detailing this novel. Otherwise, this is going to be like a 16-hour lecture video. But I at least wanted to really set us up with the first few sentences, okay? So that's how I want you to approach this novel, to think of everything with every lens possible and to be able to understand perspective in terms of why the white people might be closing ranks, but also why, of course, the Black majority is so angry in terms of why they feel, this tension and this anger and this resentment. And so that brings me to the next note is be mindful of the racial tension. Make note of it and consider the historical context. The way that Jean Rhys presents, she is writing from the perspective of a young white Creole. And so there are so many other perspectives to be mindful of, but in terms of this is her perspective, in terms of this is how she feels, this is how people are responding to her, both, the English colonials, but also both the, ex-slaves as well as the local Caribbeans and local Jamaicans, right? There's a lot going on in terms of how they're treating each other and how they're treating her and how people are talking about each other. So when you note that, there's even a mention of the Emancipation Act and also a mention of all of that. So just, I guess, kind of be mindful of that. The first couple of pages are also help set the tone because it is clearly there are negative tones to it, negative aspects. Like Mr. Luttrell, what does he do in the beginning of the novel? What happens to him? Also the fact that, the little mention of the horse. Again, all of these things are in the first 2 pages, all these events, and they're all really dark events. And that, of course, sets the tone of the rest of the novel. Of course, moving forward, consider the description of the garden and the garden of the Colibri estate. Note the descriptive words. I underlined it. Gone wild, overgrown, dead, light was green, flourished, snaky looking, octopus, twisted, brown, bell-shaped mass, sweet and strong, wild. And so I want you to note those descriptive words and how, I guess, do they play with your understanding of, the place and how important it is to Antoinette. And also the mention of the allusion, the biblical allusion, in the beginning of this description, the tree of life. Tell me the relevance of that. What is your understanding of that particular biblical allusion? Where is the tree of life? What was that story? What was the ending of that? And think about how that might relate to what she's saying about the Colibri estate and what she's saying about maybe, the significance of that place. So things like that. Also, I guess, be mindful of the introduction of Christophine and just in general, the introduction of any of the characters and how they're developed. Think about the songs that Antoinette sings to her on page 18, the types of songs, and I guess how they develop our understanding of her situation. And also just the way that Christophine is described, how she looks, how she's viewed, how other people view her. Those are things that are important in terms of characterization, okay? In terms of all of that. So, Okay, so I'm going to move forward again to pages 20 to 22. Again, if you have any questions, please see me or email me or ask me some other questions. But page 20 to 22, I kind of wanted you to focus on the situation with her friend Tia. Consider their relationship, how it was brought about, what they did together, but then what factor really came in between their friendship. What happened with that pool incident specifically that led there to be a problem between the two of them? And the picture hopefully will help you. I put that purposefully, and so what thematic idea might that connect to, right? And essentially with that whole episode, not just about Antoinette and Tia, and just so that you are aware, and maybe you weren't as clear, Antoinette is a white Creole and Tia is her black friend. And so just be mindful of that. Okay, so I'm kind of moving forward. What is the episode of the pool, the aftermath of it, when she's by herself, what she thinks about herself, how she views herself, and then when she puts on Tia's clothes, and when she goes back and how she, feels, what does it tell us about her sense of identity, how she feels and how she views herself? Like, has she crafted her identity? How does she view herself? And then, of course, in general, actually not just these pages, but all the pages in terms of how she describes the natural world, how Antoinette, our main character, describes nature, what does she do with it? How does she feel when she approaches nature? Thinking about that in terms of how she turns to it, right? And also thinking about how the description of it helps keep track of her state of mind. And so again, keep track. If you're noticing there are parts where it's like, she sounds like she's a little confused, then make note of that, because that's important to note. We know at the end of the novel what happens. This is not a surprise. I've said this so many times. We know that by the end, she is essentially insane and she, is not of a conscious person. And so I want you to be able to see that development from beginning to end, because clearly it wasn't like that as much in the beginning, but you start to see moments of it arising. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so pages 26 to 20, we know that the Causeways, Annette and Antoinette Causeway, the characters are super confusing. Maybe make a little list of them and make note of who they are, like a tree or something, just to help you out. But of course, Annette is remarrying Mr. Mason, and Mason should be a familiar name from Jane Eyre, but they are getting married, and Antoinette is a bridesmaid to her mother in page 26. And of course, Antoinette hears gossip about her mother. So we learn about Annette a little more through what the local white Jamaicans say, the local English colonials. How do they view her mother? What do they think about her? What do we learn about it? Also, what do we learn about Mr. Mason? Like, why is he here? What is his motivation? Why is he marrying Annette? Is he in love with her? Did he fall madly in love with her? Or there was some other reason? I also want you to be mindful of Mr. Mason, the original Mr. Mason, not Mr. Richard Mason that we know in Jane Eyre, but the father. I want you to think about, I guess, almost his characterization, his naivety, his careless racism, honestly, and his understanding of the Causeway situation and also the local ex-slaves. And that leads us into kind of the tension that's built up after the marriage, because Annette keeps insisting that they are not safe. They are not safe. And why does Annette understand that they are not safe, the Causeways? Like, what about Annette and her family and her history, I guess, on the islands allows them to be unsafe among the other, I guess, servants, former slaves, freed slaves? Like, why is she aware that they are not safe? Especially considering that she is now married and rich now. And so also Mr. Mason, how is he aware or unaware of their situation? And also, how does he view the local, the local Caribbeans, the local black ex-slaves and the servants, and kind of his understanding? He's very kind of naive, and also know that he is an English colonial. So he wasn't born in the islands. He came from England. And so maybe as an outsider, as an extra outsider, he's very much unaware. And so note the details, I guess, behind Christophine, Obeah, Voodoo. There's a couple of mentions there, I think somewhere on page 28. So just kind of making note of that. And also in 3034, when we build up to the fire, because annotate that fire, but when the fire happens, there's actually a lot of moments where Jean Rhys is very effective with how she builds up that tension. The description of the landscape, what happens, what they notice about, the village, also the dialogue, particularly again with Mr. Mason in terms of when Annette and Aunt Cora are like, hey, we should leave, hey, we're not safe, and he's like, oh, no big deal. That kind of contrast of the dialogue. And also, of course, Antoinette's thoughts and her actions on page 33 to 34 in terms of how she goes and she waits for Christophine, who never shows up, which again is like a ... kind of suspenseful moment. Also, Antoinette's thoughts about the stick that she wanted to have, and also how she thinks she hears things, and all of that builds up to, of course, the fire, which is my next slide. And so I want you to note down, like, when the fire occurs, the reactions of the different family members in terms of how they respond, especially, I guess, the men and the women, but also, the different races that respond to it. How does Annette respond to it? What is her focus? How about Aunt Cora? How about Mr. Mason? What does he do when the fire occurs? And then, of course, all the individual servants and what they do. Who disappears? Who is still there? Why? And also just in general, the reaction of everyone outside. And also Antoinette herself, of course, and how she views it. It's all in her perspective. And so I want you to be mindful of all of her perspective and maybe why it's written in that way of her perspective. And of course, in the fire, Coco, the parrot, rest in peace, really tragic. But I really want you to focus on Coco the parrot in terms of what you notice. Why, when, what has happened to him, what has been done to him, who might he symbolize, thinking about his actions. If you read the introduction, it's already a spoiler alert, which is fine, not a big deal, but he is very symbolic, thinking about this fire and, I don't know, another fire that we're familiar with, in Jane Eyre. And then, of course, the last part of this section is the last paragraph with Antoinette and Tia. I want you to kind of reread that section in terms of how they view each other, their attitudes, and how they react to each other, how Antoinette reacts, and also how Tia responds to her. And then the very last two sentences, I looked at her and I saw her face crumple up as she began to cry. We stared at each other, blood on my face, tears in hers. It was as if I saw myself like in a looking glass. Again, you have this reflection motif in terms of when you look at yourself in a mirror, it's like you're looking at yourself, you're the same, but also not the same. And so those are things to think about. Essentially, those are things I want you to be mindful of as you're reading. I don't know if this is going to help you understand it any better. I hope it does. If you're still like, what the heck's going on, Miss Manuel? Please, of course, see me live lecture or office hours or email me. And so make sure that you're reading pages 41 and 56. That's my next video in a couple of days. And that's it. I hope you are doing well. I miss you. And that's all. Okay, toodles.